بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رحب بكم بهذه الأمسية الرمضانية الجديدة من سلسلة الندوات اللي تعقدها المستقلة بمختلف المواضيع. موضوع اليوم أتوقع من المواضيع التي تحظى باهتمام كبير بين المشاهدين. راح نتكلم بها عن موضوع الصراع ما بين قيم الليبرالية الوطنية وقيم الدينية الإسلامية في منطقة الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا. تعرفون في السنوات الأخيرة بدأ هذا الصراع بين مدرستين فكريتين، كل منهما يدعي الحقيقة لنفسه، ووصل الأمر إلى حد تكفير الآخر. والأمر ليس فقط عند الإسلاميين، وإنما حتى عند الليبراليين والعلمانيين. بدأوا يعني هناك اتجاه قوي نحو المغالاة في هذا الاتجاه وتكفير الآخر المعارض أو المخالف لهم. والحقيقة في كلا الاتجاهين اللي سائدين هناك كثير من النظريات، هناك كثير من الرؤى المختلفة ضمن مدى واسع من التباينات. لكن المشكلة الرئيسية هو أنه إحنا ما حد سمع بينا رأي الناس ماذا تريد. يعني كل من يعتقد سواء في هذه المدرسة أو هذه المدرسة أنه يمتلك الحقيقة ولا يعرف أو ولا يطلع على ماذا يريد الناس. ندوة اليوم أكثر راح تركز على موضوع أيضا هذا اللي يعني من وجهة نظر المواطني الشرق الأوسط. إحنا طبعا راح نخصص حلقة للعراق أيضا. فالكل يتكلم وكأنه يمتلك الحقيقة مبتعدا عن ما يريده الناس. في كتاب الشهير اللي كلكم تعرفوه أو سمعتوا به أو قرأتوا، هنتنغتون أشار إلى موضوع يعني في آخر كم صفحة يقول أن اللي هو صراع الحضارات يتكلم فيه. يقول المشكلة الكامنة في مواجهة الغرب هي ليست الأصولية الإسلامية بل الإسلام نفسه. وبالتالي هنتنغتون جعل من الإسلام هو العدو وليس حتى بعض الأفكار الإسلامية. طبعا في المقابل الإسلاميين كفروا كل واحد وكفروا الكثيرين من يقولون بأطروحات الليبرالية أو فصل الدين عن السياسة. هذا الموضوع سنحاول أن نناقشه اليوم، بس قبل لا أقدم أنا بس أريد أن أعطيكم فكرة عن كيف يفكر العراقيون. هذا الموضوع درسناه ويمكن بديت ويا بروفيسور منصور بدراسته في العراق من 2004. والخلاصة اللي راح أقدمها في حلقة قادمة إن شاء الله مخصصة فقط للعراق. الخلاصة هي كالآتي: العراق أو الشعب العراقي شعب متدين. كل الأرقام اللي تطلع عندنا متدين ببعده. احنا اخذنا الاسلام او الدين ببعدين، البعد الشخصي والبعد الاجتماعي. ببعد الشخصي وببعد العبادات، العراقيون بكل المقاييس يرون انفسهم انهم شعب متدين، بل ومتدين جدا، ومن اعلى الشعوب اللي سجلت معدلات التدين. لكن بنفس الوقت على بعد الآخر اللي هو بعد المعاملات مع الآخر والبعد الاجتماعي، العراقيون علمانيون جدا، ليبراليون جدا. هذه المعادلة اللي يعني لازم نفهمها إذا أردنا أن نعرف شلون نعالج مشاكلنا في العراق. أنا اليوم راح أخلي الموضوع هذا على موضوع الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا من خلال الكتاب الجديد اللي صدر حديثا لبروفيسور منصور، اللي يتكلم عن الصراع بين القيم الأصولية وبين القيم الليبرالية في الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا. معي اليوم اثنين من أفضل من عرفتهم يتحدثون في موضوع القيم الدينية وفي منطقتنا، في منطقة الشرق الأوسط. والأول هو البروفيسور منصور معدل. بروفيسور منصور معدل أنا أتشرف أن يكون زميل وصديق، واشتغلنا سوا لفترة طويلة ولا زلنا لحد الآن. بروفيسور منصور معدل هو بالأصل من إيران لكنه أمريكي، أستاذ علم الاجتماع في جامعة ماريلاند، وهو متخصص في الدراسات الإسلامية وبالذات في الموضوع القيم عند الشعوب الإسلامية، وله كثير من الكتب نشرها في هذا المجال، ويستند على منهجية عملية وليس نظرية. هو يستند على المسوحات وعلى آراء الناس في المنطقة. الكتاب الأخير هو راح يتكلم عنه، بالنسبة لي يشكل انعطافة جديدة في علم الاجتماع الذي يختص في هذا الموضوع. الضيف الثاني هو البروفيسور شيراز ماهر. وبروفيسور شيراز ماهر معروف أيضا عالميا على أنه واحد من الخبراء في مجال أفكار الجماعات الجهادية والمتطرفة والعنف السياسي، وهو مدير دراسات العنف السياسي والأفكار الأصولية في جامعة أو في كلية كينغز كوليدج، وأيضا هو كاتب معروف وله كثير من الكتابات، وهو أستاذ زائر في جامعة جون هوبكنز. راح أبتدي مع البروفيسور منصور. وتسمحوا لي راح نتكلم بالإنجليزي والترجمة الآن راح تجيكم بالعربي مرة أخرى. اللي يريد يسمع بالعربي يختار لغة، أكو جوة عندكم بالبانل يختار الخيار اللي هو برتغال، مكتوب البرتغيز اللي اللغة البرتغالية، بس هي اللغة العربية راح تطلع لكم. طيب. Thank you, Professor Mansour, for your time. And I'm really honored. We have been working together for a long time right now. You still owe me your book, your recent book. I'm waiting for it to take my time in reading it. But here we will discuss the main top lines, the main topics which you focused in. In your book, you mentioned that the political complexity of MENA region is shaped by the clashes between liberal nationalism and fundamentalism. And this is for me a new theory which is promoting clashes between civilizations in a different way that Hennington talked about it. Can you put more highlights on that, please?
Well, let me begin by thank you very much, Dr. Monrez, for having me here. The honor is all mine. And I'm very pleased to see again your daughter, Rand and Maha, and also to virtually meet Professor Shiraz Maher. And I'm looking forward to meet him sometime in person in the future. Let me begin by first clarifying one important point about Islamic fundamentalism. when we are talking about Islamic fundamentalism, we are not talking about religion of Islam per se. We are not talking about basic religious belief of the people. Rather, we are talking about a particular attitude or a particular orientation toward one's religious belief, or toward Islam in this case. To elaborate, the belief in God, for example, is a religious belief. If you believe in God, you are a religious person. Now, the belief in the Trinity of God, Holy Spirit, and Son, or God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, is a Christian belief. The belief in the oneness or the unity of God is Islamic belief. Now, the belief that my religion is closer to God than your religion, that only the followers of my religion will go to heaven, only the follower of my religion should have the right to engage in religious activities, in religious worship, and your religion, the followers of your religion should not have this right. These are all fundamentalist beliefs, because attitude, certain orientation that is basically rest on religious intolerance, religious exclusivity, literalist reading of the religious text, and they basically believe in some sort of a disciplinarian conception of God. So there is a major difference between a religious fundamentalism or Islamic fundamentalism as an orientation and a basic religious belief. So I argue that in this book that there is a major clash between Islamic fundamentalism and the liberal values. So it is in fact the clash of value within civilization, not between civilization. So, and I argue that the political complexity of the Middle East, particularly in the past decades, is shaped, as it were, by the clash between these two diverse and opposing ideologies. And I argue that the future development of the Middle East is based on how this conflict is resolved. Whether the liberal values of individual liberty, expressive individualism, gender equality, and secular politics are institutionalized in society, or they are undermined by the fundamentalist systematic and rigorous attack on these values in order to promote a system of male domination and male supremacy, authoritarian religious government of the type like Islamic Republic of Iran, gender inequality, as I said, religious intolerance, and xenophobia, and in-group solidarity. So the analysis that I advance in this book is based on 60,000 face-to-face interview of respondents based on national representative samples from Egypt, Iraq, that you were the active participant, Lebanon, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Tunisia, and Turkey. Over 20% this covers about 400,000 respondents. No, excuse me, it's 400,000 Muslims, or 27% of the world Muslim population. So what we have uncovered can be said, can maybe generalized to the rest of the Muslim population. On the national level, it appears that the countries on average, like Lebanon, Tunisia, and Turkey, are more liberal and less fundamentalist. As a matter of fact, Tunisia is among the most religious liberal countries that in the region that we have data. And also, on the other side, Pakistani and Egyptians are more fundamentalist and less liberal, and Saudi Arabia and Iraq is in between. The national context that is more pluralistic, that women participate in the labor force more extensively than others, that has the structure of the government or the political institutions are sort of fragmented, it is not unified. Those national contexts promote liberal values and undermine religious fundamentalism. So this is on the national level. We also look at the variation in liberal and nationalist, liberal and fundamentalist attitude by age, education, and gender. Generally, women, younger respondents, and those with university education tend to be more liberal and less fundamentalist, something that we know. But one of the most interesting findings is that young women between age 18 and 29, this is the young age group that we define, are much more liberal than the rest of the sample. So based on this data, I can argue that women are going to be at the forefront of change for gender equality and individual liberty.
This is interesting. This is interesting, Mansour. I'm sorry for interruption because this is very important. One of the most shocking phenomena for me during the last demonstrations and protests in Iraq, that we had a very high percent of young females, young Iraqi females, going to the street to demonstrate and protest, asking for more freedom. This is very interesting. Can you put some more highlights on that, please?
Well, this is also the same in Iran. In Iran, even younger women take their heads cut off, stand on a utility box on the sidewalk, and use the symbol of female repression as a banner of liberation. So we have seen that in the past couple of several decades, particularly since the Iranian Revolution of 1979, there has been systematic attack on gender equality. Women have been under a lot of pressure. They are deprived of education. They are being under discrimination in the job market, in the political field, and they have come to the point that they cannot take it anymore. And since the fundamentalists have singled out women as a way of establishing their own authoritarian male-dominated society, it became a target in opposition to which liberal movement emerged. So it is natural to see that particular female activists to be at the forefront of change because they are the one who has been the #1 victim of religious fundamentalist movement in the region. And it is not just among the Muslims, it is also among Christians, among the Jews. I have actually done a survey of Jewish fundamentalism in Israel recently, and I have seen that in terms of attitude, the Jewish fundamentalists, Christian fundamentalists, and Muslim fundamentalists are remarkably similar in terms of their attitude toward religion, their attitude toward liberal democracy, their attitude toward individual liberty, and their attitude toward generally freedom. If you put them all in one room, in all likelihood, they get into fight and hit each other to death. But in terms of orientation, they are remarkably similar. So the followers of equality and social justice, particularly gender equality, among Christians, among Jews, among Muslims, are fighting the same enemies, and that is the fundamentalist movement. Another interesting finding was that we know that in terms of the liberal values, there is a difference between the younger and older generation. In Pakistan, the gap between the old and the young is much wider than the other 6 countries. Another interesting finding of the study is in terms of attitude toward development. We know that, and the respondents from these countries know that there are differences between westernization and development. And another interesting aspect is that many of the respondents believe that basic religious beliefs that, like believing in God or believing in the truth of the Quran, contributes to more developments. So the notion that religious belief undermine development is not correct from the respondents' perspective. So it is a sort of a religious modernity that religious belief contribute to more development. But at the same time, respondents believe that more development contribute to the expansion of religious values. Again, going back to the idea of gender equality, more than 80% of the respondents from these countries believe that a higher level of gender equality, if women are treated more equally in society, that would lead to more developments. And more than 90% of the respondents believe that more development would bring about more gender equality. So again, from that perspective,
Mansour, sorry for...
No problem.
Sorry for interruption, because I found out that one of the interesting things for me was your argument that the progress, the development is not a result, it is a result of these values clashes. It's not a result of economic progress or the communist argument about the clash between different classes, etc. Can you please, I just want to highlight some important arguments in your theory.
Oh, very good. For a long time, social scientific theory of cultural change or changes in value related these changes to the level of economic development. You know, they divided societies of the world into traditional, modern, and transitional. And or they look at divided societies between East and West, North and South, materialistic and post-materialistics, according to my colleagues. Again, and they argue that somehow changes in value relate to changes in the economic conditions. And it was a dominant theory, but for a long time in the 20th century, we have seen changes in economic development, but no democracy, no modern values. But as a matter of fact, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, in the Middle East and North Africa, when these countries were at much lower stage of economic development, their attitude was much more positive toward religious liberty, toward individual liberty, toward democracy, than it became in the late 20th century. So I argue that it is a mistake to link values to economic conditions. Actually, from the social scientific perspective, it is hard to connect economic development to changes in value, as if somehow someone who makes a lot of money or become industrialized, it is going to become a better person. It is not necessarily the case in terms of liberal democracy. People's value change as they try to resolve the fundamental issues that they encounter. So the best way to look at value change is to first figure out what are the dominant or historically significant issues in a society. In the Middle East and North Africa, in the past, I can say 100 years, despite the cultural diversity, despite the publications of many books, perhaps thousands of books and articles on culture, despite the emergence of a varied social movement, revolutionary activities, and so forth, the issues in relation to which these movements emerged and analyses were conducted, theories were offered by different social scientists, these issues remain remarkably invariant, and about no more than half a dozen. These are referred to individual liberty, the freedom of individual versus the domination of individual by either religious institutions or the state. The issue of identity. What kind of people are we? Are we primarily Jordanian, Iraqis, Egyptians, or Muslim, Christian, Jews, or Arabs, Kurds, or Turk? The issue of gender equality. And what is our attitude toward the outside world? You know, how do we relate us as a Muslim or as an Iraqi to people from other countries? So the manner in which these issues were resolved decide the orientation of culture and the intensity and the direction of cultural change. Okay. So if I want to summarize.
Yeah, please summarize, because I need to go to Dr. Shiraz. Yeah. So can you summarize it, please?
Yeah, if I want to summarize, perhaps the theory of the history of cultural change in the Middle East and North Africa in 3 words. The first one was political. In the late 19th and early 20th century, that the intellectual leaders and political activists believed that the best way to make our country more developed, more prosperous, is to fix our political institutions. If we have a more democratic government, everything else would fall into place. So they tried to establish some sort of a secular democratic government, but for a variety of reasons, it didn't work. But in the middle of the 20th century, the second word was economics. The belief was that if we bring our economy under the control of the government, nationalizing foreign companies and nationalizing the property of the merchants and landowners, we are going to make our countries more developed. So if you have seen in places like Iraq, Egypt, Syria, we have the rise of pan-Arab nationalism and Arab socialism. However, that didn't work. We know that more of the Arab nationalist regime ended up with authoritarianism and not much prosperity for the people. And in the later period, that was the second word. The third word was religion. They said, maybe we were not religious enough. Let's go back to religion in order to make more developed. The religious organization of politics turned out to be a disaster. You know, it is a cursory look at the credential of the Islamic Republic would tell us. We see the rise of Al-Qaeda, the rise of Islamic State, Daesh, the rise of the Taliban. It brought more and more misery to the public. Now we are going back to liberal democracy. The best way to make our country more developed is to have a more democratic, transparent government, a government that respects individual liberty, gender equality, and secular politics. People are certainly religious, but they do not want religion to be mixed with politics. And the Iraqis have been at the forefront of that change, as the survey that you carried out have shown that majority of Iraqis believed in the separation of religion and politics.
Okay, thank you, Mansour. I will come back to you with the question and answer. Now I will go to Professor Shiraz. Professor Shiraz, as Professor Mansour argued, the clashes right now is not inter-civilizations, it's intra-civilization. So it's inside the Muslim countries, inside the MENA region, we have these clashes, or this clash between the fundamentalism values and what he called national liberalism. What do you think? And you are an expert with fundamentalism in MENA region. What do you think about this argument? Do you have different narrative to present here, please?
Thank you very much. Firstly, Professor Munkith, Professor Mansour, for the privilege of being here today. I know it's Ramadan as well, and so a lot of people are tuning in despite having fasted through the day. I should say, whilst I'm speaking, the time in London will pass for the fast to open, so I might just take some water at that point, but I will continue otherwise. Thank you also, Professor Mansour, for your book. I think it's a very important topic that you are addressing, and one that really stretches into the heart of this issue that we're looking at. You know, I've been studying now extremist Islamic movements for a number of years, and you're right, I think, to identify that we are passing through a phase right now where there is a clash within rather than a clash without, as in a sort of inter-civilization, it's intra-civilizational, where this issue is taking. And that, even over the last 2 decades, has been a shift, because when we think to the post-9/11 environment and the so-called war on terror years and the war on terror conflicts that took place principally in Afghanistan and Iraq, then that discourse of radicalization from Al-Qaeda as it's reaching out to younger people was primarily one of saying that the West is at war with Islam, that this is an attack on Muslims. So it was presented in a more straightforward civilizational context. More recently, with the challenges in particular that we've seen in Syria and Iraq, it became a lot more sectarian, it became a lot more internal. And the discussion from extremist actors such as Daesh, for example, to portray the fight that they were engaged in as a battle for the control of Islam, for the future direction of Islam itself. And so you could see the way the messaging was shifting in terms of how they were seeking to reach out to people, how they were seeking to engage them, and the mechanisms by which some of that was happening. I think that's the heart of the struggle that exists right now within Muslim societies, not just in the MENA region, but I think across the Muslim world as a whole, and wherever you have Muslim communities, it affects them in the West as well. And this issue of secularism, how far do you take it? Where does it come in? Just as you were wrapping up there, you mentioned that Iraqis want to see a separation of church and state increasingly, and that these things are happening in the region. You can see in the Gulf some interesting initiatives over the last few years where the governments have appeared to engage more in trying to promote some versions of Islam, partly as a response, I think, to what you have seen as the challenges of the previous years. So you can see an increased discussion about secularism and an increased discussion about creating a more neutral public space, so that yes, of course, if people want to pray, if they want to exercise their religious rights, that's perfectly fine, but to also create a slightly more positive space for those who choose not to as well. And of course, we know famously, Mohammed bin Salman spoke about returning to a form of Islam that was more liberal, and that created, in and of itself, the statement alone created a fascinating discussion, and it is a discussion that exists, and it's important for the Muslim world to have these discussions and for the Muslim world to engage, I think, in these debates, so that it gets a better sense of where, as societies, as people, as civilization, we intend to evolve and to travel in communal groups. So, it's worth certainly at the more, you could say, conservative end. I spent a lot of time looking particularly at Salafi literature, particularly from Saudi. There are important scholars such as Safar Hawali, for example, one of the old, sort of known as one of the Sahwa Salafis from the 1990s, who opposed the House of Saud having a military relationship with the United States at that time. These are people who understand very well liberalism. I think we're sometimes quite dismissive of them, but actually, Hawali in particular has written books on the topic of secularism, of quoting German philosophers, Kant, and all of these individuals to say, look, this is a problem for Islam. If we accept a secular outlook, or if we create a sort of more liberal society, then as far as they're concerned, this, this will reduce Islam to what the church has become, and that it retreats from public life and stuff. So there is this fascinating debate, and of course it's bound very closely with this issue of identity. Who are you? And again, Professor Mansour was talking about this very important point. The story we all tell ourselves, either about us as individuals, about our families, about our communities, about our nation, or indeed as Muslims about Islam. What is this thing to which we subscribe, or to which we belong, or with which we interact? And the greatest challenge for extremist movements like Daesh and for conservatives and others is that for them, the notion of this hybrid identity, that you could be multiple things, or hyphenated identity. So I would say I'm a British Muslim who enjoys these two aspects of my identity, but there's many other things about me too. I support a particular football team. That's a part of my identity too. I work at King's College London. This is part of who I am. And so these things are incredibly important. And so Daesh, when they were straddling parts of Syria and Iraq, spoke explicitly about a desire to destroy the gray zone. And what is the gray zone? Well, the gray zone is the space. Can I get some water? Oh, the gray zone is the space.
You have to break your fast now?
It's fine. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry for that.
Oh, no problem. And so the gray zone is the biggest challenge, because the gray zone is the space of nuance and the space of people accepting other points of view, right? And to accept that we are complex individuals who connect in many ways with lots of different things. And so what they want to portray the world is it's Islam and non-Islam, or that this is, and then within that this is the only version of Islam, which brings me to the second point, I wanted to speak about. There was a fascinating moment, and it comes back to this point about the clash within the civilization and the clash that's happening. When when I was studying Daesh, and there were people from the UK traveling in significant numbers out there to join the movement, one family from a place called Luton, it's just north of London, 3 generations of the family traveled together. So the grandparents, their children, and the grandchildren, from someone in their 80s down to a child who was about 3 months old, traveled and declared and they released a statement from inside, from Raqqa. And they said, you know, we've come here, we're so happy, we've never been more delighted to be here. But at the same time, they said, you know, we stayed Muslim despite the British government's attempts to wash away our Islam. And that's a very interesting statement, because when you put it in context, who's the one really washing away Islam? It was Daesh who went and destroyed any version of or manifestation of Islam that didn't represent theirs. Takfir against the Shia and destroying their presence in parts of Syria and Iraq, destroying Sufi shrines, destroying anything that didn't conform to their very particular, narrow and extremist interpretation and construction of Islam. So it was an interesting moment in that sense to see that. And again, you can see where there's more discussion now about ideas of having liberal space. The UAE government, for example, spoken a lot about the year of tolerance, inviting the Pope and others, and having this interfaith space now that they'll be building. So there are lots of challenges and moves happening in that sense. And so the final point I wanted to make, and I'll stop on that, and I think, again, it sort of lends itself to an interesting consideration, is the point about when Dr. Mansour was mentioning about how countries like Pakistan, for example, which is where my family originates from, or in Egypt, these places are struggling a lot more with liberalism. Well, and you see that sort of tension, social tension and political tension between people manifest much more. You can just look at the response to the coronavirus and the way that government, Muslims, and you know what it is, so the way Islam has responded to it has been fascinating to watch. In Pakistan, there was basically the risk of social unrest if the mosques weren't allowed to be open for Ramadan, and particularly for Taraweeh. And so the government has tried to find a compromise, which really speaks to either, well, both its own weakness about its ability to enforce social distancing and to ensure public order in these times, but also from the complete unwillingness of the ulama and those in Pakistan who led this campaign to consider Islam from anything other than a very traditional perspective, and to think creatively about all of the provisions, for example, that Islam might make or allow for somebody in that way. And you can see, last night, actually, I looked just on the Haramain Twitter channel to see the way Taraweeh are operating in Mecca. And it's an interesting response that they've taken to this, which clearly is emphasizing the need to preserve human life and to protect people from catching the virus and so on, but yet still symbolically maintaining the fact that the mosque remains open just to a very limited number of people who are performing Taraweeh. So all of these things we're seeing in real time. We're living through this moment where this debate, both intellectual but also a physical clash, is happening within Islam, looking at this aspect of, as I say, that inherent tension between liberalism and essentially a secular output from there, and more conservative and extremist elements who want to try and control and buffer that debate. And so I'll stop there, inshallah, to open it up for Q&A.
Okay, thank you. And you can take a break for a few minutes.
Sure.
If you're
no problem.
Taking the break. I will use my right as a moderator to ask two questions to you, which I noticed and which was in my mind for a long time right now. 2 years ago, I started with colleagues from United States, scholars from United States, a research on fundamentalism, on ISIS recruitment. And I have been lucky enough to access to ISIS fighters in their prisons in Iraq. And I conducted around 45 in-depth interviews with the fighters, with these ISIS fighters, current fighters who had been captured in Mosul and different areas after being freed from Daesh. And there were two questions in my mind, and to find out the relation between the ideology and the recruitment of these fighters. So two things, and I want to ask you about it. One is, I found a really weak correlation between the fundamentalism ideology and these ISIS fighters. So most of those who have been interviewed, and this will be published hopefully by the end of this year, I didn't find those fighters adopting these fundamental ideologies of ISIS. Of course, those were the average fighters, not the top fighters. The second thing, which is based on that question, is, and I want you to comment on that later on, please. Based on the theory of Professor Mansour, the clashes between fundamentalism and liberalism values, do you think that by expanding liberal values in MENA region, we will be able to establish a buffer zone between fundamentalists and the rest of the people? I will leave this to you, sleep on it, and you will answer that after going back to Mansour to answer some questions. So right now, Mansour?
Yes.
You have some question here. We have a question to you in English. The Arabic one, I will translate it to you later on. So you can answer the one that you have in English.
Okay, let's see. There are two questions. Let me open it.
It's in English. There are problematic verses in the Quran that are exploited the extremists. How can a liberal Islam address verses that are conducive to intolerance, violence against non-believers, on the repression of women, as for example, in the verses that permit punishment of wives?
Perhaps the best answer to this question is provided by what is known as Muslim feminists. People like Mumtaz Ali from India in the late 19th century and Qasim Amin from Egypt. They have reinterpreted many of the verses that provided support that evidently that on the surface provided support for violence or for male domination. I know that there is one, I believe in the Surah Al-Ma'idah, I believe, that is a discussion about how to punish those who violate the rule of God, that they not only should be killed, but also should be tortured to death. That particular verse was expressed or imaged or inspired, to say it perhaps correctly, after the Muslims were savagely attacked by their enemies. And it is more of a historical situation, and that was later on questioned and abandoned by even Islamic orthodoxy. So many of those fundamentalists who advance literalist interpretation of the text should really educate their religion and historical Islam much more extensively. And part of the problem is that what is important is to have a wider knowledge of the interpretation of Islam advanced by leading theologians in the past that led them to, or prompted them to abandon those particular aspects of the Quran that appears to condone political violence. You know, it has been basically abandoned in the Islamic jurisprudence. Only fundamentalists are using this.
Okay. Rand, you have a note for the audience? Rand? اوكي. يا جماعه بالنسبه اللي يريدون يسالون يقدرون يكتبون السؤال، يكتبوا لنا اياه على بالعربي واحنا نترجمه. فيكتبون اكو جوال Q&A، يكتبون السؤال اللي يردوه. اظن الشيخ عبد الهادي الدراجي راد يسال، فاذا يريد يقدر يكتب. اوكي منصور. One more question about the relation between Arab Spring and this value clashes. Do you think that there is any relation between the clashes which you described in your book between liberalism, fundamentalism, and Arab Spring?
Yeah, very good question. Actually, I can answer this question better than the previous one. We asked respondents what they consider to be the goal of the Arab Spring: to establish Islamic government, to fight against the infiltration of Western values, democracy and economic prosperity, and other values. The great majority of the respondents, more than perhaps 60 or 70%, believe that the goal of the Arab Spring was to promote, was for political freedom and economic prosperity. So the participants in the Arab Spring knew what they wanted. And those who had a more fundamentalist belief were less involved in the Arab Spring. And according to respondents, religiosity or the formation of religious governments was important for only less than 20% of the public. So the people who had a greater support for liberal values were more supportive of the Arab Spring than those who were supportive of the fundamentalist values. So in this book, I argue that the Arab Spring is the beginning of a new cultural episode in the Middle East and North Africa. And it is not dead, it is continuing as we have seen the changes in value. But it will take some time for the changes in values to be translated into fairly strong movement. We have seen those movements recently in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Iran, in Turkey, in Tunisia. But this direction is going to continue. But of course, things may change as a result of the outbreak of unexpected event like this coronavirus. And we don't know yet what effect it's going to have on people's political and religious values.
We have a question from Mr. Mazen Sahib, who is a journalist from Iraq. He is asking you, Dr. Mansour, about the criteria for your analysis. It seems that you use, as he thinks that you use a general criteria, unified general multinational criteria like gender in your analysis. But have you found any local differences? Have you found or have you touched a special local criteria for analysis for different countries?
The major dimension of local variation is the difference between cities and rural areas. The people from the urban area tend to be less religious fundamentalist and more liberal than the people from the rural area. In terms of religiosity, in terms of sect, the Shia tend to be more liberal only in Lebanon, Pakistan, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. But in Iraq, it is just the opposite. The Shia tend to be less liberal and more fundamentalist.
So it has to do with the authority, with the power?
Yeah, exactly. With the structure of power relationship. In Iraq, so many of the Shias are under the influence of the propaganda of the Islamic Republic. But surprisingly, the Shia in Lebanon are less so.
Yes, I mean, many people think the opposite. I mean, the propaganda of the Islamic State of Iran in Lebanon also very strong.
Yeah, it is. But, you know, Lebanon has a sort of a pluralistic structure. You know, is much more open society. And my sense is that the tie between the Hezbollah and the Islamic Republic is more of a sort of organizational and economic. And I don't think that the Shiite population have bought into the type of Islamic fundamentalism that they promoted by the Islamic Republic in Iran. You don't see, I mean, relatively speaking, Shiite in Iraq are affected to some extent, you know, by the propaganda and the influence of the Islamic Republic, but not to the same extent as you see it in Iraq. Yeah.
Okay. Here
and more so, actually, the Shiite in Saudi Arabia is much more tolerant and liberal than the Sunni. It is amazing. You know, initially the Shia tend to be more fundamentalists, you know, according to previous surveys, but later on, it seems that the Shia tend to be much more liberal in Saudi Arabia.
Again, it's very clear that it has to do with the structure of power, because
exactly.
in Iraq, as you know, since 2004, when we first started checking on that, always Sunnis were much more liberal than Shias. This is the main takeout from Iraq. But I want to ask you about Tunisia, because you mentioned that in your study, the Tunisians were more liberal than in comparison with other nations you surveyed. Yet, and I think Professor Shiraz here will support that, all statistics show that the ISIS fighters, main chunk of ISIS fighters, they came from Tunisia. And Tunisia was one of the main sources of recruiting Daesh fighters. So can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, this is one of the puzzles actually for me, because Tunisia, in terms of religious tolerance, they display a much higher level of religious tolerance than any of the public from the 7 countries. But a colleague of mine did an interesting analysis, probably you're familiar with it, is that they analyzed the movement of youth to Europe. So there is a high level of compared to other countries, of the youth in Tunisia, high percentage of youth who are trying very hard to, through the sea, to go to places like Italy and countries from Europe that close to Tunisia. Mm-hmm. When that is blocked, the next possibility is going to Egypt and Syria. So I cannot explain it, but if I want to speculate, it seems to me that there is a level of adventurism that is a bit higher among the Tunisian youth than it is among the youth from other countries. So their first destination is to go to Europe to have a better life. If they cannot make it, let's go to Syria or Iraq and fight the infidel. I do not know. I'm just speculating.
Okay, I will ask Shiraz about your opinion on that, Shiraz.
Thank you. Well, look, sorry?
This contradiction in Tunisia between having a lot of ISIS fighters, originally they are from Tunisia, yet our surveys show that Tunisians have the highest liberal values among other countries.
Yeah, you know, it's a very interesting case study. I'm no expert at all on Tunisia, but as you say, your surveys reveal very interesting facts, and it does chime with what we saw with the extended number of people who went to Syria and Iraq to join Daesh. I think it comes back to that issue I was discussing before, that there is this huge divergence at the moment within Muslim communities, within Muslim societies, about what the future direction looks like. And of course, Tunisia was one of the first countries in the 2011 uprisings that swept so many countries in the region. Well, they also came through it in the most interesting way. They're the ones who had a peaceful transition of power, not just in 2011, but thereafter as well, after Nahda transitioned out of government. So they've gone through, as a country, a very interesting thing. And as I say, I think it really fundamentally comes back to this aspect of identity, both at the social level, at the societal level, and at the national level. And this is really sort of related to one of the questions you asked me when I finished speaking, which was this issue of, does liberalism offer a buffer, essentially, against extremism? Well, yes and no. There will be people who feel very threatened about a discussion of liberal values, about creating a secular space, that is a neutral public space, which is more accepting of different things. Well, for some people that will be quite problematic, and they may wish to retreat as a result of that. And we know a lot of people, for example, who do go and join movements like Daesh, do so because of aspects of identity, about aspects of who they are and what they want to be as they understand it. And so they are opting into these things in slightly different ways. But of course, having better political representation, going with those liberal structures, liberal values, will help people to forge for themselves what it is that they want for themselves, for their families. So I think ultimately, yes, the sort of promotion of liberal values and so on will be a good thing for the region and so on. But we're not going to get to that endpoint quickly. I think there is a tussle. And we've seen those tussles happen historically with the Christian church in Europe for many, many years and stuff. And so it will, I think, continue to be something that is fairly turbulent and stuff. And there was a point you made just as well, Dr. Munkit, then I'll stop. When I finished speaking about the ideology of some of these foreign fighters, particularly ones who'd come from abroad. Well, it's very interesting. I'm several years ago now, there was the release of entry documents that members of ISIS or Daesh would fill in when they arrived to join the movement. And so this is your kind of registration form. And it's a very interesting document to look at, if you think about it, because it's something that the author, whoever filled it in, didn't expect anyone to see, on the outside. It's an internal document. And they are self-reporting about themselves, where they came from, what countries they visited. But one of the questions asked them, what is your level of Islamic knowledge or of Islamic understanding? And particularly for the ones who traveled from the West, they said about themselves that it was very poor, it was very weak, they didn't have a tremendous understanding. So whilst these young people who went off and joined ISIF have a misguided or a naive or shallow understanding of some of these concepts and they buy into them, that doesn't take away from the fact that they hold on to those distorted opinions with tremendous conviction and sincerity. So they speak lots about, either sectarianism or concepts like martyrdom or all these types of things without ever really understanding them. So that's the divergence. Were they committed believers? Well, yes, they were. They were very strong believers in something. It's just something that the rest of us would regard as incorrect. But to them, their understanding of it was nonetheless very committed.
Okay, thank you. There is a question for you here, Shiraz, asking you about, in your presentation, you mentioned the Salafist fundamentalism, especially against Shias. But the question here is, to Dr. Shiraz, can you give us any example of ISIS attacked Shia society? The question saying is that we know that ISIS only attacked Sunni societies or communities. So it's how can you say that it's against Shia? It's anti-Shiism.
Well, I think we need to look at the two things here. Firstly, there's no doubt, if you look at the literature of this movement, and it produced a lot of it, and of course, it has its roots back to Abu Musab, Zarqawi and his movement after 2003. So it's been continuously a movement that has disparaged the Shia, that has been quite anti-Shia, and really making collective takfir on anyone who is Shia. But I don't think it's accurate also to say that they didn't attack the Shia. When they could do so, they did, either in Syria or Iraq. And so we need to separate out intent or aspiration from capability. So people also famously say, well, why did it never attack Israel? Well, it was nowhere near, but I'm sure they would have liked to if they had the chance. And so we need to consider what the group was doing. It was engaging in a state-building project in parts of Iraq and Syria, and it was looking to expand its territory. So I think it was really about the capability of the group to do it. But it is a group that isn't just opposed to the Shia, it's opposed to any Muslim, any Sunni who is not conforming to its very, very narrow construction of what Islam is, of what the definition of a Muslim is. And that's one of the things you can see with fundamentalists and extremists, is that in their version of things, it's very easy to become a non-Muslim. It's very difficult to be a Muslim, because there's a very narrow consideration of what that means.
Okay, thank you. Rand.
Okay,
yeah.
Just before opening the mic for the attendees, we still have a couple of questions on the Q&A, if you want to look at them. And also we have now a question on the chat: how the Arabic Spring led the Arab societies either to liberalism or to conservatism. This is from Abdul Latif from Saudi Arabia.
Yes. To whom this address he didn't mention?
He did not.
Okay. Can you open or tell them how to open?
I mean, if someone wants to speak from the attendees, then please just raise your hand and then I can open the mic. But I already have a couple of people who have raised their hands. It's just, yeah.
In Arabic, please.
Okay. مرحبا جميعا، كل عام وانتم بخير. بالنسبة للاتنديز، إذا أحد حاب يحكي بليز بس حطوا على raise hand اللي هاي الإشارة مع الإيد، على مود أقدر أعرف إن من أفتح. حاليا عندنا 2 محطوط إنه أفتح لهم. تقدرين تسمعيني مدام هدى؟ اوكي تمام ماشي. اثنين بس افتح لهم حاليا موجودين، بس قصدي لسه احنا عندنا على Q&A وعندنا على الشات اسئله، فاذا حابين تجاوبوهم قبل لا افتح المايك.
Okay. Mansoor, there are a couple of questions for you in English. You can read it, but before answering it, we will have a direct questions from audience. So,
you want me to open the mic?
Yes.
Okay.
Please.
Okay, so I will start with Mr. Abdul Latif. Okay. اوكي. استاذ عبد اللطيف، فتحت لك المايك، اذا تفتحي ميوت من عندك بس بقى. اوكي. حاليا انت حضرتك مسوي ميوت، فاذا بس تشيل الميوت من عندك.
مساء الخير.
تمام.
مساء الخير.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, تفضل.
Hello.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
تفضل. Yes.
Yes. My question is, how do you see the Arabic Spring led the movements, the traditional movements in the Arab societies to either left or right?
By left or right, what do you mean, left or right?
I mean, to liberalism or to conservatism.
Okay, this question is for Professor Mansour or Shiraz?
Yes, to Professor Mansour.
Yes, well, thank you for your question. From the people's perception, the Arab Spring major goal was to expand freedom, democracy, and economic prosperity. So what people wanted to accomplish as a result of participating in the Arab Spring is to bring about a government that is more responsive to their needs and more active in promoting economic developments and prosperity, and also more respectful of individual liberty and is more transparent. So that is what the data showed, and people who were more liberal tend to be more strongly in favor of the movement of the Arab Spring. People who had a fairly strong sort of religious fundamentalist orientation either did not participate or their participation was not really significant. So from that perspective, as I try to argue in the book, the Arab Spring represents a major historical event marking the ushering in of a new cultural episode in the Middle East and North Africa. There was also a question regarding, people believe in the Quran and the contrasts between religiosity and liberal values. Well, many of the verses of the Quran is subject to interpretation and understanding. That is why we have Islamic jurisprudence that took perhaps more than 100 years of debate and discussion among members of the Jurist Council, the ulama and the fuqaha, to develop. The meaning that is in the religious text is cannot easily be understood without the ability to interpret that. To give you one example, according to perhaps the analogical reasoning or qiyas, the Quran said that don't drink wine. It doesn't tell you why, it just suggests that you shouldn't be drinking wine. So if you well, believing in the Quran, so people who believe in it, they don't drink wine. But how do you decide not drinking other liquid that has the same effect? So for the members of the Jewish Council, you know, the people who first made the foundation of Islamic jurisprudence, Abu Hanifa, he argued that we need to understand the reason or the meaning hidden in the Quran, in the Quranic verse. And the reason, and in order to understand the reasoning behind it, we must assume that God, by sending the Quran, had the intention of the welfare and the happiness of the individuals. Therefore, drinking wine is prohibited not because it is called wine, it is because it causes intoxication. So anything that causes intoxication is therefore forbidden. So we must accept the fact that intoxication is something bad, even though the Quran didn't say it directly insofar as I know. Please forgive me, I'm not expert on the Quran, but I'm just trying to make a point that even the literal reading of the Quran is not sometimes a correct thing to do. People must be able to understand it, the reason behind it, and the people who advance from the rationalist perspective have come to the conclusion that the Quran and the teaching of the religion is consistent with the modern way of life. And as a matter of fact, historically, the fuqaha and the ulama always try to adapt Islam to the changing conditions of social life by advancing a new understanding of the holy religious text.
تمام. افتح هسه المايك المستر هادي. تمام.
شيخ عبد الهادي.
اوكي.
شيخ هادي. تسمعنا شيخ هادي؟
ايه
تفضل تفضل تفضل. سمعك.
مرحبا.
اهلا ومرحبا. تفضل تفضل. تفضل شيخ.
نسمعك احنا.
ما ادري واضح الصوت. السلام عليكم.
تمام. وعليكم السلام.
واضح الصوت يا خادي. كتبي له
واضح الصوت.
واضح.
نعم يس.
كتبي له.
استاذ منقذ الست المترجمه واضح الصوت؟
واضح تفضل.
حتى نبدأ بالسؤال. واضح؟
واضح.
نعم. شكرا جزيلا للأستاذ منقذ داغر على هذه الجلسة، والشكر موصول أيضا إلى الدكتور منصور والدكتور شيراز، وقد أغنوا البحث. الحقيقة الصراع، كل الصراع الدائر في المنطقة بين أصوليتين متزمتتين إنجاز التعبير. الأولى هي التي تتحدث عن علمانية، ولكن ليست علمانية ليبرالية، وإنما هي علمانية تتقاطع مع الدين وتدعو إلى فصل الدين عن الدولة، أو فصل الدين عن الجانب الحياتي، عن الفضاء العام. وأعتقد أنه في الحديث عن الأصولية علينا أن نتحدث بحيادية في جانب الطرفين. الطرف الأول هو الطرف العلماني نفسه، والطرف الثاني هو الطرف الإسلامي، أصحاب الحركات الراديكالية التطرفية. أنا اسمح لي أن أنقلك إلى نموذجين من العلمانية الدائرة اليوم في المنطقة واللي نحتاج أن نتحاور معها. الحوار مع العلمانية الجمهورية قد يكون حوارا منغلقا، فبالتالي يعني اليمين المتطرف الفرنسي الذي يمنع الحجاب، يمنع الجاليات من ممارسة حقها، أعتقد هذا هم أيضا ألقى بظلاله في فرنسا وفي غير فرنسا على التطرف والانغلاق العلماني في هذه الدائرة. أما إذا أردنا أن نفتح القضية أوسع فعلينا أن نتحدث مع العلمانية الليبرالية التعددية كما يسميها شارلز تايلور في كتابه العلمانية وحرية الضمير، فتلك لا يمكن أن تفصل الدين عن المسار العام. وبالتالي نحن عندما نريد أن نتحدث عن الأصولية مما يؤسف له في نقاشاتنا نتهم الإسلام فقط في هذا الجانب ولا نخوض في جوانب أخرى من العلمانيات المتطرفة التي أدت بالنتيجة إلى الانغلاق وإلى الانحسار. ثم أن نريد من الإسلام أن ينفتح على الآخر، هذا مهم جدا، خصوصا أننا إذا أردنا أن ننفتح مع الآخر على الآخر أن يقدر كل الظروف الزمانية والمكانية والاجتماعية والثوابت الدينية والثوابت العقائدية والثوابت الأخلاقية التي تتناسب والمنطقة الإسلامية. ما يصير إحنا لا يجوز لنا أن نناقش الإسلامي ونقول له لا بد لنا أن نصدر لك علمانية غربية. نعم نصدر له علمانية، ولكن هذه العلمانية التي تنسجم مع واقع وثوابت الجمهور الإسلامي والذي يعتقد بأنه لا بد من الانفتاح. أنا في عبارات القرآن الكريم التي أشار إليها الدكتور الكريم دكتور منصور، كثير من العبارات تدعو إلى الحوار الإنساني. يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم، وبالتالي تعالوا إلى كلمة سواء بيننا وبينكم ألا نعبد إلا الله، دليل على محورية الانفتاح على الآخر. فليس من الصحيح جدا أن يطرح البحث على أنه هنالك تطرف في واقع واحد ولا يوجد تطرف في الجانب العلماني. الجانب العلماني اليوم مطلوب منه أن يؤكد حقيقة مائزية العلمانية الليبرالية التعددية التي تؤمن بأن الدين يجب أن يشارك في الفضاء العام، وبين العلمانية الجمهورية المنغلقة التي تؤمن بفصل الدين عن الدولة. أنا أستطيع أن أسميها إلى ما بعد العلمانية. هذا هو السؤال الأساسي والمهم. هل أنتم تشخصون هذا؟ هل يمكن أن نلغي التطرف من كلا الجانبين ثم ندخل في حوار إنساني مشترك ورسم جغرافيات حوارية إنسانية؟ وعلى تعبير ألفريد ستيفان في كتابه ديمقراطيات في خطر يقول: هل من الممكن نشر التسامح والتسامح المتبادل؟ شكرا لكم.
شكرا شيخ. شكرا شيخ. I'm sure that Mrs. Huda translated this to you, but I just wanted to summarize it as I know Sheikh Abdel Hadi, and we have a lot of arguments before and discussion before. So the questions for both of you is about the model of secularity. The Sheikh Abdel Hadi, who is a Muslim Sheikh, very moderate, open Sheikh, he believes that it's not only the fault of religiosity or those who are on the right side of religiosity. It's also the secular people. They are trying to separate religious from life, not from politics. They are trying to separate or just put the religious on shelves. He believes that there are two models of secularity, which is the French model, which cannot fit with Muslim cultures, history, norms, etc. And there is another secularity which believes in opening on others, tolerance, etc. So he is asking to have both sides understand each other and not to try to dismiss anyone from the general life. I will take a comment from Professor Mansour and then Professor Shiraz. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Excellent question. 2 points. First, my argument here was on religious fundamentalism, as I said, not on religiosity per se, number one. So I did not want to imply that when we are talking about religious fundamentalism versus liberal nationalism, I meant to put liberal nationalism in opposition to religion. That was not my intention. Rather, I was discussing the conflict between fundamentalism, religious intolerance, religious exclusivity, sectarianism versus liberal values. That was point number one. Point number two, I fully agree with our friend that actually secularism is a problem. And as a matter of fact, in some cases, secularists didn't understand what, in the Middle East and North Africa, they had failed to understand what secularism is all about. Secularism doesn't mean to be anti-religion or causing or forcing people to abandon their religion. No, it is, as a matter of fact, one reason that we saw in the 20th century, the rise of fundamentalism is because of secularism and secular value turn into an instrument of power. It was based on the perception that if the government and the society abandoned religion and put religious group and institution under pressure, their societies become more developed, more prosperous, more industrialized, and so forth. That was a mistake. But the result of that produced fundamentalist reaction. So I am in agreement with this sheikh concerning the problem of secularism. But secularism basically is predicated with the idea that the state, the government, number one function in society is to serve the people, to engage in maintaining security, expanding the infrastructure for economic development, fixing the road, expanding the universities, and helping the poor and protecting, advancing social security. The government has no business of being a teacher and an ideologue. The government is not a religious government, is not a communist government, is not an educator. It is up to people and their own institution to educate one another. So secularism, from my perspective, is that a government must be ideologically neutral in order to perform its functions effectively. If secularism turns into an ideology or an instrument of power, then we would see the rise of fundamentalist reaction. And this is something that we want to avoid.
Yes.
I just wanted to make a short point on that. I think, you know, it's an important observation. And the reality is, look, in every country, the system is slightly different. So the example of French secularism was mentioned. Well, the way the secular model works in France is different to the UK, which is just next door, which is where I'm sat, where the official head of the Church of England is the Queen. And so if you want to talk in the very technical terms or the strict term of having a separation of church and state, or religion and state, then even the UK doesn't have that model. So I think it's entirely appropriate for the Muslim world to have its own discussion about what liberalism looks like within the Islamic context, what a secular space might look like. And of course, even within the Muslim world, this is a very diverse range of people with cultures and languages and so on. You know, the construction of those would change also from country to country within the Muslim world, just as the Muslim world itself is so diverse. So I don't think when these discussions are raised, we should naturally just say, well, this is how the French do it. What does that mean for us in Iraq? Or this is what the way the Germans do it. What does that mean for us in Egypt, or things like that? It's about looking to everywhere to see how things are developing and evolving, and for us to have our own dialogue and discussion about that.
Okay. Professor Shiraz, there is a question for you in Arabic. I can read it also from Mr. Mazen, who is asking about the reappearance of fundamentalism in Sunnis incubators in Iraq. I mean, we have witnessed recently more attacks by ISIS on some Iraqi areas and Syria also. So how do you explain that, and do you expect that this will emerge again?
I think it's very, we need to unpick this very, very carefully and with lots of nuance, because what has happened in Iraq is different just to what's happened in Syria, and the dynamics of the various turbulences in both countries are feeding off different things. But let's start with Daesh. Now, Daesh is a movement that will continually seek to exploit the situation on the ground in order to try and capitalize on it for its own interests and benefit. And we're seeing that in a number of ways. So it will, of course, seek to exploit the current situation with coronavirus for its own ends. It will seek to still try and message to people in order to try and build support base again. And this comes back to good governance, right? If people don't have basic security, it's one of the things I talk to my students a lot about, is your physical security, your individual security. The idea that, you know, leaving your home to go just to the end of the street to buy some milk, you might get kidnapped, or you might get shot, or a bomb might go off, and some. Well, if all of these things are part of your normal reality, then your event horizons change, your outlooks, your perspectives, all of these things are very different. You operate differently as a human being than if you have basic human security, the expectation that when you go to sleep at night, you will wake up in your bed in your home, that if your wife or children go outside to the supermarket, that they will return, and these kinds of things. So groups like ISIS will seek to capitalize on those moments in order to try and sell their vision to people. And we've seen great hardships in Syria and Iraq, in lots of places, to where they were able to march in with their messaging and to say, look, here's an alternative system, here's an alternative model, this is the way, you know, we can do things. And people have to make pragmatic choices in those scenarios for themselves and for their families. And, you know, I'll use the Syria example more because that's a country that I work on. I'm by no means an Iraq expert, but Syria I have worked on. You could see at the start of the uprising when society was breaking down in certain places, and it was moving from a revolution of protests in the street to more of an armed opposition towards the regime. When groups like Jabhat al-Nusra began to appear in people's areas and stuff, they could deliver security that the state wasn't delivering. And again, people have to make very pragmatic choices. If someone comes to harm my daughter, I don't have time to sit around and think about liberalism and extremism. I need to keep my child safe, and that's my first priority. And so the extremists are very good at coming into these scenarios and to present themselves as alternatives that are there to look after you. And so, as you know, Dr. Munkith, we've been doing a big project at my center. You've met with some of my colleagues in Iraq as well, to look at how groups like Daesh and more generally Jabhat al-Nusra and some of the others, Ahrar al-Sham as well, have begun to try to create their own systems of governance for people in their areas as a means by which to try and appeal to them and to win support. So I think that is the reality of the way that groups like ISIS will continue to be around, and all of the underlying issues that allowed the group to evolve, particularly in Syria, you know, are not just still present, but in many cases much, much worse. If I was from Raqqa and so on, well, what does my life look like today compared to what it looked like 10 years ago? So you know, I may have disliked the regime 10 years ago and have grievances against it and so on and so forth. But today I'm likely to have lost family members. I'm likely to have lost my home. I'm likely to have lost my livelihood, all of these things. And so until there is a structural change to affect the insecurities of people in those areas, then groups like Daesh will continue to try to come in with an alternative vision for them.
So, I mean, this just fits with my argument that Daesh is not live on fundamental ideologies only. Daesh lives more on a mixture of socio-political situations and circumstances on the ground. And on the top of these socio-political circumstances is the feeling of security. The insecurity, the feeling of insecurity, we found out from our surveys that before Daesh took over Mosul on 2014, the most indicative index was the feeling of insecure. People in Mosul and Salah ad-Din, they felt that they are not safe in their neighborhoods. They are not feeling safe in their neighborhood. So right now, Daesh, and by the way, even during Dawlat al-Khilafah al-Islamiyya or the ISIS state, when we asked people in Mosul under the control of al-Khilafah al-Islamiyya, or what they call it, al-Khilafah al-Islamiyya, about the most effective achievement for ISIS, people there, they answered that it is security. We are able now to feel secure in our houses. So this is a good advice for the Iraqi government and for all governments. They should not leave any vacuum to be used by ISIS. I mean, vacuum in insecurity. Going back to Mansour. Mansour, you have a question here. Saying that question for Dr. Mansour: when you shorten people into two groups, either liberals or fundamentalists, and define the fundamentalist extremists, then you are saying that anyone who believes, for example, that inheritance should be practiced as what Quran said is an extremist. I'm just asking you, as Muslim, how can someone be at the same time liberal and Muslim?
I'm sorry. I think he answered that already before.
He answered?
Oh no, actually,
no.
Well, let's take a look. There are, in scientific research, we have to start from something, and particularly in survey, it would be hard to consider all the nuanced aspect of the same phenomena. I do not pigeonhole people in either liberal or fundamentalist in that sense that you're describing. I am basically arguing that there are people who are more strongly fundamentalist orientation, and there are people who are more strongly liberal orientation. So that means that there are a lot of people in the gray area, as I have discussed in the book. So at the same time, we know that in reality, it would be very hard to find a person who is 100% liberal or 100% fundamentalist. In either case, people on either extreme on a personal level are going to be quite boring. People, we know that based on public opinion research, people often hold opinions that clash. That is the way humans are, and it is a good thing. I am afraid of people who have always clinged to a uniform set of opinion, like, say, the follower of Daesh. So there are people who could be at the same time on some issues quite liberal, but on other issues quite fundamentalist. On the issue of inheritance, there are Muslims in the past, particularly Mumtaz Ali from India in the late 19th century, and Qasim Amin, who believe that some of the injunction in the religion about inheritance in favor of men is because in the past, men had control over the economy and they were sort of the manager of the family. But now things have changed. Women have access to higher education, they can have a job, they can engage in political process, and in many cases, they are as intelligent, as hardworking, as powerful, even physically, as are men. I mean, particularly in terms of, if we define physical power in terms of endurance, women are much higher level of endurance than men. So under the current condition, it is totally unfair, totally unproductive to have more say and more resources at the disposal of brothers, not that this is, and discriminate against the sister. I can give you many examples in many families that the sisters or the daughters turn out to be much more intelligent, more activist, more ambitious. So why should we practice this discrimination against women because of our narrow understanding of religious texts? It is hard for me to justify it.
Okay, thank you. There is one last question for Dr. Shiraz. And I think this question is important. It's from Dr. Muhammad Karim, because there is a wide belief that Daesh and other fundamental groups, they are manufactured. They are US manufactured, Iranian manufactured, you know. You have heard this, I believe, many times before. Do you think that Daesh is a tool manufactured by the West or by Iran or by whoever to attack Islam, to attack Muslims, to control Iraq, Syria, and other countries? Can you answer this, please?
Yeah, as you say, I've heard these theories a number of times. Different countries are said to be controlling it or creating it, and so on. I think, I'd want to say that that is not my belief, and I would reject this opinion. These are products of particular circumstance and of particular environments. Without the invasion of Iraq in 2003, you don't get to Daesh because it spirals out of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then you get this thing. If it hadn't been for the way Bashar al-Assad responded to the 2011 uprising in his own country, you wouldn't have had Daesh take over large parts of the country from Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, and elsewhere. So there is a need. Look, we're Muslims discussing this issue to say that there are people from within Islam who construct Islam in this particular way. They choose to believe it is something different, and that is what they really think it is about. So even you mentioned, you know, the issue of the name itself. Do we call it Dawla Islamiyya? Do we call it Daesh? Is it a Khilafah? Was it not a Khilafah? This is the debate. Now, look, we could see the majority of Muslims rejected that opinion, but lots also bought into it. So this is a product of many unique things. It's a product of where Islam itself is today and where the Muslim world is moving through in terms of its own discussion and thinking about the religion and where it stands. Then it's linked into broader geopolitical issues of international politics, domestic politics, localized corruption, oppression, what we were just discussing, a lack of human security and that feeling of insecurity then that people are feeling in their day-to-day lives. So, you know, let's, I would say, admit that these things are of us. And then we can, from that perspective, begin to tackle them and to challenge them and to, you know, undermine them rather than to blame external actors continually for our own problems. The West and the outside world has its own problems, but, you know, and plenty of them. But this one is ours, and we should take it.
Well, thank you. شكرا لكم. راح قبل لا أختم أود أن أشكر الأخوة الحضور وأقول إنه إحنا الآن أمام خيارين. هذا الانقسام الفكري الحاصل بين مؤيدي العلمانية أو الليبرالية ومؤيدي التدين بصيغة الإسلام السياسي، وهذا الصراع المحتدم بيناتهم. احنا امام واحد من حلين: اما ان نتعايش معا او نقتتل ونتصارع. وما اعتقد اي واحد بالحاضرين راح يفضل الخيار الثاني. التعايش معا هو السبيل الذي لا بد منه، لكن حتى نتعايش علينا ان نفهم بعضنا البعض. علينا على الاسلاميين ان يفهموا كيف يفكر الليبراليين، وعلى الليبراليين أيضاً أن يفهموا كيف يفكر الإسلاميون، وأن يتقبل كل منا الآخر. لذلك إحنا راح تكون عندنا ندوة أخرى إن شاء الله فقط مخصصة للعراق والتحولات اللي حصلت في العراق، وراح يكون ويانا أيضاً ضيوف مميزين لهذا الغرض. ويمكن السبت القادم أيضاً عندنا ندوة مهمة جداً عن الفساد ومؤشرات الفساد بالتعاون مع جامعة الدول العربية ومع منظمة الشفافية الدولية. أيضاً راح نعقدها إن شاء الله يوم يعني كما مخطط له يوم السبت القادم. أكرر شكري لحضوركم، أكرر شكري للبروفيسور منصور وبروفيسور شيراز، كان نقاشا ممتعا. Thank you Mansour, thank you Shiraz, really appreciate your time and hopefully we can meet again.
Certainly, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to meeting everybody, and good luck. And stay safe.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiraz. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.